Stanford University.
You're going to recognize some of the slides because you've seen them before. Hopefully you'll recognize a lot of the material because you've presumably seen it in a biochem class or in an evolution class or whatever, but it's going to be put together totally differently. As I mentioned last time, what we're going to do is look at the question of how predictable is evolution. What happens if you rewound the tape? For those of you who are old enough to remember things like tape recorders, cassette tapes, and those are things they had tape on them. It's sort of like Scotch tape. This is before CDs, you know. One of these days, we're going to have students who are so young that they're not even going to laugh. They're going to say, "What are you talking about?" But you do get the idea, the metaphor of rewinding the tape, you know, rewinding your CD and going back to the beginning. So what could we predict? Would we have exactly what we have today, or would we have something totally unpredictable or something in between? And so, as I say, this is totally idiosyncratic. You don't need to buy everything that I say. In fact, I might be a little worried if you just bought everything hook, line, and sinker. But what I'm trying to do is get you to think. Okay? So, ready? Put down your email. Ready to think. Okay. You can see I've fixed this slide since you last saw it. Now the pinnacle of all evolution is Stanford, which is what it should have been earlier, so I'm sorry about the mistake on the previous slide. You've seen this before. It just reminds you that we had the formation of the Earth 4.6 or so billion years ago, and there were a lot of great moments in evolution, origin of life. We're not sure if that was before the late heavy bombardment period, 3.8 to 4.2 billion years ago. Some of these numbers should start to sound familiar. They're on the sheet, what every hum bio graduate should know, and I'm not sure if I've posted it yet, but I will make sure that that's up because that's sort of the bottom line stuff that I really expect you to have committed to your gray matter. It's only a couple of pages, but it sort of gives you the sheet of what you have to know before you graduate from this class. And some of this you do need to know. So we have all these great moments, and so you can think about rewinding the tape to any of these moments and ask, would they occur again? So really, as I said, what we're doing is asking, is evolution predictable? Which is kind of a funny question. If you talk about physics, you say, what about the laws of gravity? Can you predict what would happen if I take a book and drop it? I mean, I can predict what would happen if I drop the mouse. The first thing is that Jesse and Carlos would probably dive for it because I would destroy it. But you know what's going to happen, obviously. It's going to fall. There's a law-like nature to gravity. There's a law-like nature to a lot of these laws of chemistry. But the question is, are there actually laws in biology or just things that we happen to notice happening a lot? And this is obviously pertinent to astrobiology. We need it to understand exactly how evolution works. And if there's life elsewhere, and if it was elsewhere, can you predict what it would look like, what it would act like? Because how can you find it or look for it if you have no idea what it might be like? And of course, we want to know because we have some interest in the future of life on Earth. Now, this is important because we want to know if there'd be certain outcomes. Now, part of the problem is that biology, as I think I've mentioned earlier, works on statistics. It's very difficult to say with 100% certainty how many children each of you are going to have. Again, I hate to keep harping on it, but this is a biology sort of section here. But statistically, we can say, well, statistically, we're going to say there are about 1.8 children that you're going to produce on average in this class or whatever. That's a totally different sort of thing. So maybe it's a law-like nature if you talk about statistics. But now this is a very different sort of thing than saying that there is actually a directed evolution, that it occurs in some sort of progression. We can see some changes statistically, but you don't get a prediction in terms of evolution. We know from here is going to end up there because it keeps adapting. It's sort of a subtle point here. Okay. Now, I'm going to set up three people as sort of part of a straw man set of arguments. Two of them were involved back and forth quite a bit. No longer because 2 out of 3 of them are no longer alive. But I'm going to just sort of set them up as representative of different points of view on this. And the first is a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. And what he stressed was contingency. Yes, there may be certain things that you have to do in evolution, because you have certain laws of nature. For example, we can't float because we can't defy gravity. If we're going to defy gravity, we have to expend energy to get up in the air like a bird or an insect or whatever. But that most of what we see is due to contingency. Stuff happens is sort of the way it looks, you know, like it. You could be brilliantly fast, brilliantly smart, and have 800s on every one of your SAT scores. But if you're standing under an asteroid and it hits you over the head, it's not going to matter whether you had an 800 on your SATs or a 200. You're gone. So things do happen that have nothing to do with how brilliant you are or how fast you are or how many children you have or, you know, anything like that. Things do happen. So we're going to say that Gould represents this contingency point of view. And if you look at one of his books, for example, Wonderful Life, The Burgess Shale and the Nature of History, he makes that point over and over. Full House, I think, is another book that he makes that point. So you can go back and look at that. Wonderful essay writer as well as an evolutionary biologist. If you're not familiar with Steve Gould, I can certainly give you lots of recommendations. He wrote a little column in Natural History for many years, which were just little short essay gems about evolution. Highly recommend it. Now I'm going to set him up. He was a professor at Harvard. Simon Conway Morris is a professor at the University of Cambridge. And what he argues is that the details are not as important, but you do get some sort of pattern that is predictable. And part of it you can argue from convergence. And I'm going to be doing a lot of arguing from convergence today. In other words, that two organisms independently come up with the same solution to a problem. Now, when this happens, and particularly when you've got multiple organisms coming up with the same solution, or at least solving a problem, it starts to give you more and more confidence that this is relatively easy to do. And we'll give examples of it later. And there's an example of one of his books where he discusses it, The Crucible of Creation, The Burgess Shale, and The Rise of Animals. You see both Burgess Shale books, both paleontologists. John Maynard Smith is no longer with us either, another British evolutionary biologist. His view is that there's a series of historical accidents subject to engineering constraints on the one hand and the conservatism of development on the other. In fact, all of them are sort of saying the same thing, but Gould and Conway Morris got into more of a sort of argument about this, which is the predominant mechanism. We can take some of this and try to predict into the future, for example. And I bring this up because there is a marvelous book along these lines by Dougal Dixon, who is not actually a biologist. But he took a lot of principles of evolution and said, all right, what if humans went extinct? What would happen in the next X million years? And I think it's a lot of fun, particularly because the drawings are just marvelous in there. And it's not all that easy to get a hold of this book, so I'm going to pass it around so that you can just look at a couple of the pictures. And if you don't get a chance to really look at it in depth, I'm more than happy to lend it to you or bring it back. What he was doing is saying, okay, humans are extinct, continents are similar, except South America is now an island, which is what we expect into the future. What has evolved to fill the niches that are now left behind? And there are certain principles, I'm hesitant to call them laws, I think they tend to be called rules in evolution that we can just sort of start with. Bergman's is that related groups closer to the poles tend to be larger. And this and Allen's rule are based on this whole surface area to volume ratio business, which it turns out is very important for organisms. As you get bigger, your volume increases as the cube of the radius, if you think about it, whereas your surface area increases the square. So a larger organism has a much lower surface area to volume ratio than a smaller organism. Why is this important? Because you have exchange of gas and materials with the environment, for example. You have loss of body heat. So for example, an elephant is going to be much better at conserving body heat than a shrew. And in fact, they have a much lower metabolic rate. If you're long and skinny, you have a better chance of getting rid of heat because you have a larger surface area to volume ratio. And that's one of the ideas of why these elephants have huge flat ears. It's a way to increase their surface area to volume ratio and get rid of some heat. Okay? So it makes sense that if you're going to be in a colder area, you would want a larger organism because you decrease the surface area to volume ratio. Similarly, with Allen's rule in a related group, you would have shorter limbs towards the poles. And obviously, you can think about humans too, that humans that have evolved closer to the equator, where it's more important to get rid of heat, tend to be tall, skinny, long arms, and so on, whereas humans that have evolved to be closer to the polar regions tend to be smaller, heavier, shorter limbs, so you're trying to conserve heat, right? Makes perfect evolutionary sense. So this whole surface area to volume ratio thing is very important. Okay, so what I'm going to do is structure the rest of this lecture sort of in a series of big questions. So how do we go from the Big Bang to life? How much of this could we have predicted? Well, let's start with what we need for life. And again, you've seen some of this in other contexts before. But we're going to assume that you need liquid water. Now, people have argued that there are other possible solvents, possibly ethane or methane or liquid, some other liquid, and we'll discuss this very briefly when we talk about Titan next Thursday. But the assumption has been by NASA that we look for liquid water. There are a lot of reasons to think that water would be really good, although organic chemists who work in Origin of Life actually prefer other sorts of solvents because they're more reactive. So let's just assume, because we know there's a lot of water out there, works on Earth, that it would be liquid water, but I'm not as really convinced it has to be liquid water as much as I'm convinced that you've got to have chemistry. So once you have liquid water, you have to have a certain temperature and pressure. You need certain elements, and we sort of discussed this a little bit last time. You've got to have carbon. I'm a great believer in carbon. You obviously are going to have hydrogen. You can't get around hydrogen. It's all over the place. It's in just about everything. Oxygen seems to be something that forms in these organic compounds, extremely important for life. Nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. So those are the big six, and then you start to get into some secondary ones like magnesium and I don't know, iron's very nice. There are a lot of others that are very nice and we use, but these are the big six that we use. Question is, could you have a life form without nitrogen, for example? And Rocco Mancinelli's thought about this a little bit, and he said, what you'd end up with is a sugar world. We do see nitrogen chemistry coming in there. Probably would have to have nitrogen, so you got the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Could you imagine a biota without sulfur? Could you imagine one without phosphorus? I'm not a good enough chemist, but I think these are very interesting questions. Are these really necessary for life? You do need some sort of source of energy. Presumably there's going to be a parent star, there's geothermal energy, solar energy, there are forms of energy around. And you need time. Now people throw up this, we need time. How much time? We need millions of years. Where does this number come from? It doesn't come from anywhere. I think there's this tendency to think, because life is complex, as I think I've told you before, there is no such thing as a simple organism. The fastest way to fail the final is to write simple organism. There is no such thing. If you're an organism, you're extremely complex. And so the question is, how long does it take to get a living creature? Now, we're assuming it's millions of years. This is based on nothing. Maybe it's 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Maybe it's going to be one of those things that once we figure out what the key is, what the trick is, we'll be doing assignments on Thursday. I'll be passing out test tubes and say, I'd like each of you to make life, turn it in Tuesday, and if you do a good job, you don't have to take the final. I mean, maybe it'll end up at some point to be that trivial. At this point, though, it's really sort of a black hole. So I leave time up there with a question mark. You need some amount of time, but I honestly don't know whether it's a Labor Day weekend or whether it's 50 million years. Okay? Yeah?
Are you finding is like time from just completely only inorganic matter to like a whole organism?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or something that, we consider an organism. Okay, you've seen this picture before, reminding you that there's a real reason that I love carbon, fourth most common element, capable of forming compounds. We see it out there and so on. Okay, so if we replayed the tape, would we be organic chemists again today, like we are on Earth? And we've been arguing, yes, we would be using organic chemistry, such as found on Earth, appears to be the language in the universe. We would likely use things like amino acids, because that's what we see out there. And that's what seems to be prevalent. It seems to have a very good structural role when you put those together as proteins. I don't know if we would use DNA. Our ancestors no doubt did not. They used something like a substituted glycerol, which eventually was taken over by RNA, then in DNA. And so the implication of all this is don't bother to look for something really exotic. Don't try to look for a silicon-based life form or a nitrogen-based life form. It's probably biochemically not going to be too different. It doesn't mean it's got DNA. It doesn't mean that it might not use D amino acids or whatever, but it wouldn't look completely foreign to those of you who have taken biochemistry or any sort of biology class. Not perfectly congruent, but we would probably basically be biochemists again. Okay, how does life evolve? And this is where we're starting to get into some interesting stuff here. We could just say that everything is random, it's chance, it's this, I hate to use words like this, but this sort of shit happens approach. You're under an asteroid the wrong day, or you marry the wrong person, or whatever. It just sort of happens. And there is no mechanism that we can come up with that there is no doubt some organism at some point who did it. So there are organisms that, and you have genes in your body that evolved by chance. Okay? End of story. What we think is the predominant mechanism is natural selection. And that's something that we're going to get into much more with Darwin's birthday, but it basically can be boiled down to two parts. You have a generation of heritable variability. In other words, you have variation in your offspring, and that variation has a component to it that is heritable, that will then be passed on to the next generation and the next generation. And not all of these variants can survive, and so the ones that survive are in some way better fit at that moment. Okay? It's more than actually survive and produce offspring. Now, can either of these stages be determined? Are they contingent, or is natural selection even the only game in town? And I've already shown my hand and said, no, natural selection is not the only game in town. That's ridiculous. And in fact, you do hear people say, well, why is there this amino acid in this place in this enzyme? Why is there this loop? And they're working very hard to find some kind of reason that there's this amino acid or this nucleotide or whatever. And the fact is, if you're a fruit fly, if you're a Drosophila, and you're thinking about picking a mate, you don't sit there with a tremendously long list and say, yeah, let's discuss your alcohol dehydrogenase. In position 283, is it true that you have a valine? I mean, no, no one does. We don't do that. I mean, even biology nerds don't do this. We don't have these lists. You have some sort of, well, they seem like the best one I can get, and you go for it. So you can't really assume that every last nucleotide, every last amino acid is there for a reason. Some of it comes along for the ride. So let's get back to this convergence. Convergence, this is just sort of a fun slide to bring the point home again. All of these organisms have evolved exactly the same mechanism to say, get lost to a predator. All of them have spines. Probably you can recognize most of these pictures. There's a cactus in the upper left, there's a rose bush in the upper right, there's a whistling thorn acacia down at the bottom from Africa. You know what the last one is in the middle? Very close, porcupine. Every one of them has evolved the same mechanism to say, get lost. That's convergence for you. Now, let's get back to extremophiles, the pH limits for life. I mentioned very briefly in passing that organisms do as little engineering as possible when they switch environments, or actually they do as little as possible in life. If you're going to live at a very low pH, and there are a lot of organisms that do, what you want to do is keep the environment out. And so what you do is evolve a proton pump. And in fact, all of these organisms that you see way over on the left have done the same thing. They've evolved a proton pump to keep the external environment out. It's like bailing out a leaky boat. Similarly, the ones at very high pH may be concentrating some of these protons. And again, I put a lot of text on the slide so that you can go back and look at this at your leisure because it isn't written anywhere else. Okay, an alkylophile is something that likes living at high pH. An acidophile is something that likes living at very low pH. So this is convergence, nice example of convergence. So what I'd like to do is take a detour, and it's going to be a relatively long detour, to go specifically into whether we could predict whether photosynthesis would occur again. And this is actually the one section of the lecture I do have written up, and I'll send out the reference. I had a paper in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society about 2 years ago that's specifically on this, as I gave a presentation there on the time. So you'll see a lot of biochemistry and a lot of arguments from that. You're not expected to know every biochemical pathway or anything like that, but what I'm hoping is that you've at least seen some of it before and you say, oh, you know, this now goes into context in a little bit different way, and it makes maybe more sense from an astrobiology point of view than it did to me before. So let's start off with the idea that photosynthesis is a great thing. There's plenty of energy coming from our sun. We use almost none of it. That seems ridiculous. Why not have biological solar cells? More than that, take this solar energy and use it to make our cells, to make something useful. And again, to keep beating on this, since I'm assuming that life will be based on organic carbon, and most of what is out there is not organic, but things like CO2, in fact CO2, what you need to do is change that CO2 into organic carbon. You need to bring it into your body. So why not use these solar cells, couple them with the ability to take CO2, use it to help make a body, and voila, you have photosynthesis. Okay? So basically what you're saying is you're taking phototrophy, you're taking solar cells, you're taking an organism that can take inorganic carbon and turn into organic carbon, that's called autotrophy, and you're making a photoautotroph. Okay? And so what we're going to do is take a look a little bit at autotrophy and whether that could evolve again, a little bit at photosynthesis, which is a specialized case of autotrophy, and could that evolve again, and then see whether the necessary ingredients for all these would be present, whether the evolutionary pressure would be present, and what sort of evidence we have for this. And that's where I'm going to get into, like I say, more biochemistry than you thought you signed up for, but don't worry about all the details. I'm hoping to put this in a context that makes sense for you. So let's start with autotrophy. Ah, God, I didn't sign up for this. Autotrophs are just organisms that can take inorganic carbon and use it to make body parts. This happens to be the reaction that is the most prevalent one in nature. The enzyme that actually does this, ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase, a lot of people just call it Rubisco. I know it sort of sounds like a breakfast cereal, but it's easier to remember than ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate carboxylase oxygenase. The reason it just trips off my tongue is it happens to be the enzyme I worked on for my PhD thesis. But if you'd like to call it Rubisco, you may. It's the most prevalent protein in nature because it's the one that most organisms, if they're going to be autotrophic, use to take CO2 and add it to this 5-carbon sugar, ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate. You got 5 carbons, you add 1, you end up with 6 carbons. So far, it's very simple carbon math. That intermediate is very unstable, and so it breaks down to 2 3-carbon sugars. And then they can start funneling into pathways. And so you've taken an inorganic carbon molecule and you've brought it in and made it as part of a body part. Very simple. By the way, one of the reasons it's the most prevalent protein in nature is not just because it's so useful, but it's also incredibly inefficient. So plants have to have a lot of it, it turns out. When did this arise? Well, there's some people who think that autotrophy actually arose with the origin of life. These are metabolism first people. And there are certainly reasonable arguments for it, but going on this principle that life is lazy, I don't see why any organism would start off by fixing carbon. You would think that they would start off by using the fixed carbon around them, so I'm not a great proponent of it, but there are people who believe that that carbon fixation was basically the same as the origin of life. Oxygenic photosynthesis is possibly also very early. There is some indication for that. Both morphological fossils, a little bit in chemical fossils, but there are others that have interpreted some of these very early fossils as being anoxygenic organisms, ones that are not producing oxygen. So some people think they were cyanobacteria and things like that, and some do not think so. So these people believe that photosynthesis arose later. We certainly have the evidence for the oxygenic photosynthesis, the guys like cyanobacteria, by 2.5 billion years ago. Very, very good evidence by then, but it probably arose a good deal earlier. And chemolithoautotrophs, organisms that didn't use light but are autotrophic, may have also arisen much, much earlier. But again, whether that was origin of life or right after, we're not sure. I suspect it was somewhat after. Now, I tried to present a very simple view of autotrophy, that you've got rubisco taking in CO2 and you've made more body parts. But you know, there are a whole lot of other pathways involved besides this Calvin-Benson cycle to make body parts from CO2. You can use the reverse TCA cycle, the hydroxypropionate pathway, reductive acetyl-CoA. I don't expect you to memorize all those. I just want you to say, gosh, no one told me about that. You know, there are all sorts of ways that organisms can take CO2 and bring them in. And so we could just trip lightly through them, again, just as sort of a biochemistry tour. Calvin-Benson cycle, this one with rubisco, is the primary means of carbon fixation today. Every plant that you know, every salad probably that you have ever eaten has been based on rubisco. You've probably eaten rubisco today, and if not, you probably should for dinner. Okay, rubisco's out there. Cyanobacteria plants, algae, purple photosynthetic bacteria, and almost all chemolithoautotrophs. So there are an awful lot of organisms that have rubisco. There's the formula again. And here's the pathway if you really want to get into it. So then let's go on to this next one. No one ever told me about the reductive TCA cycle. It's basically running the TCA cycle in reverse. And again, I'm showing you a little bit there. What you should really do is follow this pathway saying, whoa, you know, you can start off with, actually I think I have a better, these are some of the organisms that use it, green sulfur, and so on. I think I have a better picture. Yeah, you can start to follow these cycles here. So you could start with acetyl-CoA, which just has 2 carbons. You add a carbon and you end up with pyruvate, which has 3 carbons. Phosphoenolpyruvate still has 3 carbons. You add another one, you get to oxaloacetate. You now have 4 carbons. So just focus on adding carbons. That's really what you're doing here. Yes?
What's the purpose of reversing the TCA cycle to make pyruvate?
I think the idea is you're fixing CO2, but a lot of these intermediates and some of the enzymes are already present from the TCA cycle. So it should be a relatively easy thing to evolve. In fact, there are people who argue that the TCA cycle is basically ground zero in metabolism for life. And then you get some organisms that do this, but then they, maybe change an enzyme or two. There's a hydrogen oxidizing bacterium that lives in Japanese hot springs, and it switches one of the enzymes in there to pyruvic carboxylase. Anything that ASE, is an enzyme, carboxylase is an enzyme that adds carbon dioxide. Okay, so you're starting to play with that a little bit. And then you've got this 3-hydroxypropionate cycle, and again, you can start to follow these cycles through and see where these CO2s are added. You've seen another picture of Octopus Springs before that I took from the hill, and this is down below. And you've seen that patch of microbial mat. Some of those organisms, we think, use that cycle. And there it is for the real biochemistry junkies. Carlos knows I spent hours drawing these cycles, so, enjoy them, imbibe them, print them out, put them on the wall, whatever. Anyway, but the point is that you can follow the CO2 in very different enzymes, different intermediates, but it accomplishes the same thing from the point of view as the organism. And here's another one, the reductive acetyl-CoA pathway. This is a little unusual because it's not a cycle. So you've got CO2 coming in, added to hydrogen and ending up with formic acid. You can follow that top chain, and then you've got CO2 coming in. Actually, it turns into carbon monoxide, and then the two are condensed, and you end up, thanks to acetyl-CoA synthase complex, with acetyl-CoA. So you've started with 2 CO2s, and you end up with a 2-carbon compound. Same function, again, totally different enzymes, different way to do it. So it turns out it's starting to get complex, but the idea is that autotrophy seems to have evolved multiple times. Just because everything you eat for dinner is based on Rubisco. I'm assuming that you're not eating some of these microbial mats for dinner. Everything you're eating is based on Rubisco doesn't mean that there aren't organisms out there that fix CO2 in different ways. And if it happens on Earth, you can rest assured that it at least is possible to happen elsewhere. Photosynthesis is a specialized case of autotrophy. Now for autotrophy, you need inorganic carbon, of course. You need a reductant. We've sort of skimmed over that, but you do need a reductant so that you can go from CO2 to being part of an organic compound. You need energy of some sort. In most of these reactions, you're using energy from ATP, but you got to make the ATP somehow. And you need a carboxylating enzyme, something like Rubisco, that is actually going to do the dirty work for you. For photosynthesis, the energy is in the form of light. That's the only difference from your basic autotrophy. So could photosynthesis specifically occur again? Well, we know there's plenty of inorganic carbon. And this slide we just skimmed over the other day. The thought is that on the early Earth, as a way to keep the early Earth warm enough to have liquid water in the face of the fact that the sun was only 70% as luminous as it is today when life arose, you had much, much more CO2, possibly orders of magnitude more than we have today. We're worried about greenhouse effects with very tiny changes in CO2. We're talking about much greater changes. And by the way, I've heard people say to me, actually politicians say, well, if CO2 was so much higher in the past, then who cares if we pump a little bit more in? Well, there are two answers to that. First of all, in the early time on the Earth, the sun was less luminous than it is today, and so it still was in a clement range. But more important, we're here today. We care, well, some people care because they don't want to see Miami underwater. Some people perhaps don't care about Miami. Perhaps you care. I know we have some New Yorkers in the room now. Perhaps you care about New York. Perhaps you care about Palo Alto. Perhaps you care about Indonesia. The problem is we're here now to care. No one cared if the sea surface rose during the Jurassic. I mean, none of us were around. There weren't dinosaurs angsting in their, Dear Diary, the sea level seems to be rising. Isn't this awful? We weren't there. So that's really the big difference. It's not that it hasn't happened before, but we've now set up this infrastructure on the Earth where we are acutely sensitive to small changes, small perturbations. Okay, we need reductant. Like I said, you can't go from CO2 to an organic compound without a reductant. Now, there are lots of possibilities. If you look over on the right, that's what your dinner does. They take water and they pull off electrons from that. But there are lots of other ways to reduce CO2 to find a reductant. And there are many bacteria that take advantage of all these other sorts of reductants. Every reductant that you see there on the left is used by at least one group of bacteria. So you can use sulfur, you can use nitrogen compounds, you can use hydrogen, you can use iron, you can use sulfate. All of these can be used. And then you need to be able to capture the energy in the form of light. You need solar panels. And it turns out, well, there's plenty of sun. This is just a satellite image. Again, planning your vacation is very useful. It just points out there's tons of light available. You have to start worrying about what wavelengths of light, because if you go into the UV, you've got all sorts of potential for damage, as we discussed last time. And if you go into the infrared, there may just not be enough energy there, although there are some bacteria that will use wavelengths in the infrared for photosynthesis. Why? You think, well, there's not much energy. Why are they doing this? These are ones that live on the lower layers of those microbial mats, and that's all that's left. Think about sitting at the high table and eating whatever crumbs are left over underneath. That's basically what these guys are having to do with light. They're taking the light that's left over. But most photosynthetic organisms use this light, visible light we call it, because we're not photosynthetic, but it turns out that that range of wavelengths, 400 to 700 or so nanometers, is the same that's used for photosynthesis by most organisms. So we have plenty of light in that region, no problem for that, so that could easily happen again. What about these carboxylate enzymes? I'm going to make it even worse. I went through 4 different pathways before. if you actually start playing around, which as you can see I spent a lot of time playing around, you can come up with about 18 carboxylating enzymes. Now it turns out that some of these, for example, are found in your blood, and after the carboxylation step there is a fairly rapid decarboxylation. I don't care, that doesn't bother me. What's interesting is that there are 18 different carboxylating enzymes out there. So apparently forming a carboxylase is not incredibly difficult. Now some of them actually use an interchangeable part which makes life a little bit easier. Oh, by the way, they're not all for autotrophy. Fatty acid synthesis uses a carboxylase as well. That's a little wombat I once met in Australia. I didn't have the picture there that I was going to, but we'll get back to it in a second. Selection pressure. Now, this, I think, is a rather intriguing argument. But I would argue that we would have the selection pressure for photosynthesis occurring elsewhere and again on Earth. And this is why I say this. And parts of this will sound familiar. Life on Earth is based on organic carbon. Most of the carbon in the universe is inorganic. It's CO2. I realize that Dr. Amendola told you about all this wonderful organic carbon out there. It's amazing that we see anything, but the fact is that there's more of the inorganic carbon available. Life is lazy. You can write that down or not, because if you write it down, you've just wasted energy since you wrote it down last lecture. And life is lazy. So you want to be efficient. And evolution uses what's available. Francois Jacob wrote a really interesting article that I cite every chance I get, and I believe it was 77, and I will put a link to that because you really should at least glance at it. What he said in this was that evolution works as a tinkerer, and this is an incredibly important distinction for you to bear in mind. Evolution is not an engineer where you say, you know, I want to build a photosynthetic organism, and the optimal way to do that is maybe to take silicon and use it as a solar cell and take this and that and the other thing, and you've built a photosynthetic organism that is just absolutely optimized for whatever you can afford. Evolution says, all right, this is what I'm starting with, this is what's in the garage, this is what's available to make an incremental change. So if evolution took a look at us, it would be awfully difficult to say, you know, I'm going to turn you into a photosynthetic organism, because you've already have a developmental history and a suite of enzymes and so on that's going to make it very difficult to re-engineer you. It was not so difficult to re-engineer a bacterium to start adding that metabolic function, or for a eukaryotic cell to swallow a photosynthetic bacterium like a cyanobacterium. So you have to remember that evolution works as a tinkerer, not as an engineer. And again, contingency does happen. Things happen. There are bad hair days in the history of the Earth. The worst was the lunar forming impact, but that 165 million years ago wasn't so great either. And actually the one in between was at 225 million years ago, the end Permian extinction. That was probably the nastiest mass extinction that we've had on the Earth. And I'm hoping Dr. Morrison will talk to you about that a little bit more next week. So taking those principles in mind, what sort of pathway would you expect on any sort of planet in the universe, or if we reran the tape on Earth? Well, I'm going to say that you could argue that there's certain steps in metabolism, that you have a selection for a chemistry based on organic carbon, but if organic carbon is limiting, the clever organism is going to say, you know what, there's not enough to eat for dinner, I'll just make some myself. Maybe it takes a little more energy, but in the end it's going to be a better deal because there's just not enough organic carbon at the table. So you start making your own, and again, the source of energy using the sun can be dangerous, but there's plenty of energy available from there, so maybe setting up some solar cells isn't a bad idea. Which should lead to herbivory, because life is lazy, and so actually why make your own organic carbon if you can eat someone else who's doing it? And actually, eating plants, I don't know if there are any vegetarians in the room, I don't mean to insult you, okay, you don't need to self-identify if you don't want to, but actually the nutritional quality of meat is a little bit closer to what our bodies are, so you might be better off being a carnivore. So what you see here is an argument if life is based on organic carbon, you should have a selection pressure for autotrophy. You should then have a selection pressure for herbivory and probably carnivory, and that implies all sorts of things about potentially intelligence and movement and so on. You see this sort of chain going on in the microbial world. You see this chain going on with big people, plants, and animals, and so on. And so you see this over and over, and my personal feeling is that you would see this if you reran the tape on the Earth. You would see this general pattern if you had life starting on Mars or any other place. And that's why I don't think the Viking experiments were at all stupid, looking for carbon metabolism. In fact, I did a few little experiments to prove the fact that life is lazy. There I am working in Nymph Creek in Yellowstone National Park. And what I did is I measured photosynthesis in these organisms in the presence of nothing but extra radioactive CO2, and some in the presence of the CO2 plus acetate. Now, acetate is a very simple organic compound, so it should be extremely easy to digest. And in fact, when you add the acetate, the photosynthetic rate goes way down. Growth rate doesn't necessarily, but the photosynthetic rate does, because these organisms are saying, well, why should I fix more carbon? Because, you know, Lynn's giving me acetate for dinner, might as well eat it. So there's a perfect example of life being lazy. Another case of that, we were looking at some mixotrophic algae. Mixotrophs are organisms that can photosynthesize or can eat. I've had people in my lab who feel very firmly that most microbes are actually mixotrophic if you push them, at least the photosynthetic ones are. If they really, you push them, they can eat. Well, anyway, Bacteriochromonas malamensis, many of you I'm sure are familiar with it, is a bona fide mixotroph that can eat bacteria and it can photosynthesize. So the question is then, how does it make this decision? Well, you can put it in the light with bacteria and then look at its photosynthetic rate, and surprise, surprise, it's much lower than if you put it in the light but you don't give them anything to eat. If you put them in the dark, they can survive with bacteria, but obviously they're not going to be able to photosynthesize. So you get, in this case, what we're showing is incorporation of radioactive CO2. Exactly what you would expect. So is there evidence for all this scenario? So let's look at convergence again. Well, you can converge on the same function with different structures. And I'm showing sort of random molecules there, but think about the thorns in the whistling thorn acacia versus the cactus versus the rosebush versus the porcupine. Same function, but you're converging on it. Or you can have the convergence on the same structure, but a totally different function. So let's go back to these carboxylane enzymes. You'd think, whoa, look at this convergence here. There are a ton of carboxylane enzymes, so maybe that's not all that hard to do. Oh, this is just, I mean, one more, it goes on, you know, if you want to do that. As I mentioned, some of them do use a trick, so it's really not 18 independent evolutions. Some of them use biotin. You may have skimmed over the word biotin in your biochemistry book. In fact, biotin is very good at transferring CO2. So some of these enzymes do use this trick. They take this body part called biotin and use that to transfer the CO2. So it's really not 18 independent means, but there are a fair number of means of carboxylation. That's just an example. Pyruvate carboxylase uses biotin, so on. You can look at all these pictures. We have lots of light harvesting pigments. Again, you get this feeling there's convergence going on. Of course, chlorophylls are very good at harvesting light and turning to chemical energy. But you've got beta-carotenes that can harvest light energy, phycobilins, which are found in red algae, cryptomonads, and cyanobacteria, retinols, rhodopsin, lots of different independent compounds that can harvest light energy. So maybe the light energy harvesting is not so hard. You can have multiple organisms develop photosynthesis by endosymbiosis. That picture should look familiar. And so what I'm saying is all these ingredients are there. The light's there. The energy's there from the sun. The CO2 is there. There are a lot of carboxylane enzymes that seem to have evolved. So it doesn't look like it's tremendously difficult to evolve the ability to take CO2 and add it to an organic compound or add two CO2s together to make an acetate. the light harvesting compounds are there, the enzymes are there, the reductants are there, there are a whole lot that are used. And so you start to think, well, so even if it didn't happen exactly the way it did this time, there are lots of possibilities. It can't be all that difficult. And so yes, I'm going to say, if life arose again, we would have ended up with photosynthesis again. So could it evolve elsewhere? Well, look at the prerequisites again. Is there light available? Certainly on some place like Mars, there'd be plenty. Do you have this organic carbon to inorganic carbon ratio problems? Yes. Carboxylating enzymes, well, we've never met a carboxylating enzyme in space, but I just argued that it's not all that hard to form them. It can't be, or else we wouldn't have 18 or so. The evolutionary pressure would be the same. If you follow my argument that life is based on organic carbon, it's lazy, and therefore ultimately you would want to go to autotrophy, and photosynthesis is a great way to go. And so I'm arguing, yeah, if we go and we find life elsewhere, it would not be unreasonable to look for a photosynthetic organism. One of my very favorite student evaluations once was someone has said, if for no other reason, this class is great because you get so much information that impresses girls at cocktail parties. So I consider that, sort of the ultimate recommendation for this class. So the guys might want to remember that. The women might, use that to, it's a great, did you know that the universe is 13.7 billion years? I don't know, maybe there's some guys at Stanford that's, considered, anyway, whatever. You don't, I don't tend to talk about intelligence in this class. It'll be sort of one of the few times that you'll hear me say something intelligent or something like that. Okay, we just talked a little bit about redundancy, having multiple ways to carboxylate, multiple ways to reduce CO2 to find reductants. We talked about multiple ways to protect yourself from UV radiation and so on before. So we've got redundancy in genes. We've got certainly gene families like our ribosomal genes. We don't have one, we have many copies. Yeast alone have 100 or so copies of the ribosomal DNA. There are good reasons to have backup copies. Once you have multiple copies, you can start to diverge, you can increase gene dosage. I covered some of those in this bioessays paper on synthetic biology that I just told you about last time, and so if you're interested to go into that in a little more detail, I'm happy to give you the manuscript since it's now in press. So let's go on to symbiosis, and I think you know where I'm heading there. The idea that you have chloroplasts arising multiple times, there are multiple organisms that swallowed a chloroplast and became photosynthetic. You ended up with these eukaryotes that were swallowed by other things to become cryptomonads or Chlorophylls bearing algae. All of these have a secondary symbiosis, so this happened many times. In addition, you have a lot of invertebrates, corals and so on, I should have put a pretty coral picture in there, who have taken up photosynthetic endosymbionts. These are almost always either green algae and you end up with what's called zoochlorelli, or ones with chlorophyll A and C, chrysomonads and so on, and then they're called zooxanthellae. This is incredibly important because if you don't have those, you end up with this coral bleaching and the whole ecosystem tends to crash. There are other organisms that have photosynthetic endosymbionts, again, other invertebrates, there are hydroids, there are various other sorts of things like that. Even some sea slugs can pick up chloroplasts. They get rid of the rest, but they keep the functioning chloroplasts. So this occurs over and over. There are reports of green polar bears that I wouldn't count as a regular symbiosis, but sometimes algae can live inside the hair follicles. That doesn't mean that you now have a photosynthetic bear, but it does make them look a little ugly, if you're supposed to look white. So anyway, symbiosis, we know that occurs just for photosynthesis reasons, but there are many, many, many other cases of symbiosis, organisms living together either internally or in conjunction with each other, like a lichen, which of course is a conjunction of a photosynthetic organism, an alga, and a fungus. What about multicellularity? A lot of people seem to feel that this is something we can be very proud of, the fact that we're multicellular. I'm going to disabuse you of that. Remember that tree that I showed last Thursday where you could see the 3 multicellular branches? Well, first of all, there are 3 of them, the fungi, the plants, and the animals. So at the very least, multicellularity arose 3 times. But in fact, it arose many, many, many times. You haven't seen this picture before, but take one little group of green algae, the Chlamydomonas group. Chlamydomonas is a unicellular green alga. It's used for a lot of physiology experiments. It's great for genetics and so on. It's one of the sort of E. coli of the green algal world. But it turns out that it's got a lot of multicellular relatives. It's got, well, for example, gonium, eudorina, pandorina, pleiodorina, and then the king of the group, Volvox. Volvox can literally have hundreds of cells, and there is some differentiation. They can have cells that are just there, vegetative cells that are helping to move it and so on, and then ones that produce gametes. And so you end up, see the Volvox has little babies inside. Very cute. So you're really well on your way to multicellularity. So within this group alone of the green algae, 9 out of 11 of the orders have multicellular members. Now, just to sort of put that in perspective, we're in the class Mammalia, right? So we're in the order Primates. So this is a big group, but 9 out of 11 of them have figured out how to be multicellular. You saw this very quickly, again, last Thursday, I believe. These are all the eukaryotes, basically. Most of these you will not recognize because this is the marvelous diversity of protists. We're down there, animals, I say we're reasonably closely related to the fungi. Many of you probably noticed that among some of your friends. And then there are the plants up there and amongst the green algae. But if you start going through this group of unicellular eukaryotes, well, actually all eukaryotes, and just forget those 3 big multicellular clades, I'm going to argue that almost every one of them is multicellular, or at least has some multicellular members. The different cell types may not be there all at once, like we have a ton of cell types all at once, but at least at some stage in their life cycle they have different cell types. These are the sort of diagrams you look at, and some of which you memorize if you take a protistology course. Again, weird and wonderful. There's a fruiting body. There's a beautiful little mixotroph. There's a foraminiferin that does all sorts of funky things with its nucleus. Weird sex there. Ciliates, here's an epistolus, I believe. Some people call it epistylus. Multiple little zooids, little heads. It's kind of interesting because the one that this comes from, that evolves from with the single zooid, Vorticella, was one of the first that Van Leeuwenhoek drew when he was first building his microscopes and looking for it. I have to have a fair number of drinks before I do my imitation of this, I have to say. But they really are marvelous. They have contractile stalks and these heads and so on. Anyway, Opalina, which lives in the hindgut of a frog, marvelous. There's something like 28 stages in its life cycle. These things can literally have hundreds of nuclei. I mean, this is why I say there is no such thing as a simple organism. These are not little protoplasmic blobs. Actually, each one of these cells is a lot cleverer than any single cell in your body because it has to do all the stuff within the confines of the single cell at any given moment. There's leishmania, sleeping sickness. Again, they're termite gut flagellate. Very interesting, goes through several stages of life cycle. And without these things, the termite gut flagellates and the bacteria that live in the hindgut of termites, these things wouldn't be able to eat wood. So there you have it, and I think I pointed out to you last time, therefore I think of this as temporal multicellularity rather than spatial, and if you start thinking in those terms, there's almost nothing that is unicellular. So many organisms have to have multiple stages to get everything done. Asking one cell type to do everything it needs to do in life, from interacting with the external environment to genetic rearrangement and fixing damage and dealing with desiccation and so on, is really asking an awful lot for a single cell. And so most organisms do have more than one, but not to say that there aren't advantages to multicellularity, and that's why it's arisen over and over. If you're bigger, it makes it harder to be eaten. If you've got filter feeders out there, which of course you do, you can have advantages to scale. You can start to specialize cell types and so on. You can go through senescence. You can sequester your germline so that most of the cells in your body are not doing their various functions with all these oxygen radicals and so on. You can keep your DNA that's being passed on to the next generation more pristine. There are all sorts of marvelous advantages to being multicellular. I mean, we wouldn't be what we are today if we were unicellular, much as I love unicellular organisms. There are advantages and disadvantages to each. But the fact is, because of that, it's arisen over and over and over. It's nothing apparently all that special because it's arisen so many times. So you start to think, well, if we go elsewhere, once you have life, maybe you do end up with multicellular life with some degree of certainty. What about the transition to the land? It turns out that didn't happen once. You probably saw in some textbook when you were young some fish, you know, sticking its toes out and getting its way onto the land, and next thing you know, it's got 4 legs and it's turned into a crocodile and a human and so on. Well, there are a lot of organisms that have made this transition to the land. There's a good reason to do this. As I mentioned last time, we were talking about extremophiles, that as temperature goes up, the solubility of gas goes down. So imagine you're sitting in a lake that's getting hotter and hotter, and you're a fish and you need that oxygen. Or you're at a high altitude and you don't have very high solubility of the oxygen. How are you going to get enough oxygen to breathe? Well, one thing might be to stick your head out of the water and get it straight from the atmosphere. And we think that that's where the major transitions to land in plants and animals took place, in high altitude warm lakes, where they were literally starving for CO2 or oxygen. And the way to get it was to get out of the lake into dry land. Now, that's not a panacea. You do avoid a lot of the old predators and so on, but now you have to worry about desiccation, which is a whole other set of problems, as I mentioned last time we were talking about extremophiles. So, you know, there are pluses and minuses to everything, but the fact is that it looks like that transition to land happened many, many times. Skin color. Now we get to something that's perhaps slightly controversial. Nina Jablonski is really the one who's done this work. She's a marvelous anthropologist who was at the California Academy of Sciences for many years. She's now at Penn State. And she points out that skin color is an adaptation to the environment. You know, end of story. But it's a little bit more subtle than what we think. First of all, if you look at places where there's high UV, and I believe I mentioned this last time with respect to comparing algae and humans, people end up with much darker skin. People who have evolved near the equator or have spent enough time there are going to end up with darker skin. People who are in the higher latitudes don't, because they're not getting as much UV. People who have lived for many years, the temperate regions are able to adjust the amount of UV getting through seasonally. So that should be the end of the story, and that's sort of the common conception around. But Nina points out something very important, and that is skin cancer is not pleasant, but it usually shows up post-reproductively. So why should it be selected against? It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. You need to look for something that's going to affect you before you have kids, that's going to make a difference on how many children you have and therefore your reproductive success. And what she points out is that folic acid is very sensitive to UV. Now, it turns out that folic acid is tremendously important because without enough, you end up with infants with spina bifida, which is, depending upon how bad the case is, can be fatal within minutes. This is not a good thing to have. In fact, it's so important that you have the folic acid very early in pregnancy that basically all the flour that you get in the United States is supplemented with folic acid, so that we're sure that everybody, you know, I don't care if you're a man, a woman, you know, post-reproductive, pre-reproductive, everyone's getting folic acid, just in the chance that there are women out there who are becoming pregnant who are not getting sufficient folic acid any other way. So this is tremendously important. And so what she's saying is it's a trade-off. You need enough UV to get folic acid in, but you don't want so much that you end up with skin cancer. You end up with some kind of a trade-off in there. I think I got that wrong. You need the UV to synthesize folic acid, but you don't want too much because too much can destroy it. That's what it is. So you need just the right amount of UV, and that makes more sense than adjusting your skin color strictly because of skin cancer, which is post-reproductive. And she again points out that it's not a one-shot deal. If you look at people in areas that have gone from equatorial regions to more temperate regions or more polar regions and then back up into areas with high UV, you see the skin color changing back and forth and back and forth. So this is a fairly labile sort of characteristic. Okay? Intelligence, and that's what we're going to end up with today. Why would you have anything evolving intelligence? Well, I've argued that you have this sort of trajectory in metabolism, that you have your basic organisms that are using the organic carbon available, and then you end up with autotrophs, and then you end up with herbivores, and then you end up with carnivores. Well, to be a herbivore, you don't always, but you find that most of them move so that they can go from plant to plant. Okay, so some sort of motion. You either have cilia or flagella or legs or something to get from place to place. Now, you don't have to. Not everyone does. There are sessile organisms. But most herbivores are out there moving. So if you're going to be a predator, you may need to outsmart these herbivores. And in fact, most predators move too. Now, there's certainly filter feeders out there like barnacles that are just, sucking everything in. And so they don't need to move around. They do need to move in the larval stage because they got to go find someplace else to attach and grow so that they're not right on top of their parents and so on, and they're not getting anything. Prey need to avoid being eaten. There's an evolutionary arms race there. So the predators need to eat, the prey need to avoid being the ones that they eat. Another reason for evolving intelligence is if you have a very unpredictable environment. Now, I've been sort of focusing heavily on microbes, and you can go into some kind of a desiccated state. We talked about these plants and so on that live up in the Andes where it's very dry and you can lose a lot of your body water. That's fine, but we can't do that. We have not gone through that developmental history that will allow us to get rid of 75% of our body water and end up being little, crisps on the side until it rains. That just isn't the way we work, and we're unlikely to ever get that capability. But as our ancestors lived in a very rapidly changing environment, we picked up an adaptation that other organisms, for the most part, have not picked up, and that is intelligence. As a way, instead of growing extra arms or eyes or learning how to desiccate, we selected for a brain that could deal with a changing environment very quickly. These are all organisms that were heading, we think, towards more intelligence. Top predators, and what's really fascinating is all three look almost identical. I'm sorry about the resolution of some of those. But you've got a crocodilian, a tyrannosaur, and a velociraptor. Kind of amazing. So you're converging on certain sorts of morphologies. All right, so let's look a little bit at mammals. There is, of course, one invertebrate that is the genius of the invertebrate world. Who knows what that would be? Oh, yeah, you're so close. You're so close. Oh, ouch. Octopus. Okay? We now have the three cephalopods. They're cephalopods, head, feet, cephalopod. And of those, if I had to put my money for an IQ test, I think the top SAT scores are going to go to the octopus. They can do all sorts of amazing things. When I was but a TA in grad school, I had to babysit for some briefly. And it was amazing. You put in like a flower pot into the tank, and they can sense what's out there. They built little houses, and they'd take one of their extra legs and can use it to open and close. And there's no other way to interpret it, but they could see you, and they were like a child. They thought if they had this over their eyes, that we couldn't see them. It was fascinating. And then you read all these stories in the newspaper about, ones making little houses out of coconut shells, or there was one example in a British paper where the octopus were in one tank, and then there were some fish in another tank, and the fish kept disappearing, and finally one researcher sat in there at night and realized that there was an octopus that was getting out, crawling over the other tank, eating, and then climbing back before anyone showed up. I mean, these things are very, very clever. They also have eyes that aren't bad. They're not as good as our eyes. On the other hand, our eyes aren't nearly as good as a lot of other organisms, so that we really don't have anything to brag about either. So of the invertebrate world, the octopus are where I put my money on an IQ test. These are completely separate in terms of intelligence than any mammal I'm going to talk about. This is the current thinking on mammals, which I don't stay up with from day to day, so I'm assuming it's still current. It was current last year. There are four major groups: the Aphrotheria, the Euconta plus the Glyries, the Lauriasiatheria, and the Xenarthra. And there's some examples. You can look at this at your leisure. But basically the point is that if you look at these groups, you see that we come from a stock from the Aphrotheria and Xenarthra, and then you get this branching off into the Lauriasiathera and into the Euconta and Glyries. I can't quite read it there. We're up in there, by the way. There we are with the humans and the picas and so on. Okay, where's intelligence? There's some argument about how intelligent elephants are. I think we need to give them some credit. They're down in the Aphrotheria. Look up at the Lauriasiathera. We've got the porpoises and the whales, and there's no question that they show some forms of intelligence, including helping injured members. I remind you about that absolutely award-winning info snack on the very first class on sex, where there was a mention of dolphins helping the third dolphin. Anyway, you remember that. And then we have the humans over there, and we do know that there are signs of intelligence among the humans. Not all humans, of course, but there are signs of intelligence among our species. But you can see by the distribution that this is a characteristic that was converged on. This is not an ancestral characteristic. So apparently there are times that it's a perfectly good adaptation. And that's all you have to think about intelligence as yet another adaptation for certain environments. Actually, if we want to start playing this game, there's also convergence on being aquatic among the mammals. Mammals are not primitively aquatic. Of course, we evolved from the reptiles. But there are members of at least two groups that return to the water. There you see a manatee down on the bottom right, and again you see a member of the cetaceans up in the upper left. Let's play another game here. Let's look for fossorial mammals. This is different. This is not fossil. Fossorial means ones that are digging the underground, and you see a golden mole down there, and you see some kind of mole up there. Which reminds me to mention that, does anyone here look at the Stanford Alumni Magazine? Take a look at the one this month. I've been teaching here so long they just started sending it to me, so now I read it. And there is a big story on David Starr Jordan. Who is David Starr Jordan? Every one of you has to know before you graduate. He was the first president of Stanford, okay? He was a biology professor, and that's why I bring him up, at Indiana University, where I was for my master's. There's a Jordan Hall here, there's a Jordan Hall at Indiana. He was a biology professor who then became president of the university. He was an undergraduate at Cornell, so there's actually a fellowship, sort of an award for someone who is a faculty member at Cornell, Indiana, or Stanford. It's kind of a funny combination. But the reason I bring him up here is that his contribution to biology was that he studied blind cavefish. So it's a very, very feeble excuse to mention him alongside fossorial mammals or, extremophiles. But I do feel that all of you should know at least who David Starr Jordan was, and go read that article just because you're going to be graduating from Stanford. I mean, you should know these things. Anyway, so fossorial mammals are convergent. And you know what? So are ant-eating ones. There are lots of anteaters all over the place. Why do that? There must be some good reason, and you see that they have similar sorts of adaptations. You want sort of an ant-eating type snout and so on. So perhaps that's not so difficult to evolve. So what is the role of the environment in all this? Bluntly, we're looking about how much is natural selection based on competition among organisms, and how much of it is dealing with this physical environment. And of course, in some cases it's one, and in some cases it's the other, in some cases it's both. organisms have to deal with a certain physical and chemical environment. And when we focus on extremophiles, that is the major challenge in life, surviving in that physical or chemical extreme. And I'm going to argue that actually in the origin of life that would be true, because there weren't that many organisms there when life arose, and so the big thing was just keeping body and soul together, not worrying about competition. The competition then comes later. But there is also the biological competition, the nature red in tooth and claw sort of approach. Okay? So there's both, but you have to think of it as both. And let me go back to this whole idea of photosynthesis and why you have photosynthetically active radiation. There's a good reason for that. I've been emphasizing the fact that you have too little energy in the infrared and too much in the UV, and you start to break down compounds, but you also have an issue with the visible light being able to get through the seawater. And if you've got life arising in water, you want to have access to that solar radiation enough to have photosynthesis going on without having the damage and so on. And this is physically what happens with light and water. I mean, that's what happens. And so if you go elsewhere, the same sort of thing should happen. If you're worrying about light and having access to solar radiation, something that's going to be enough energy to do something useful, to run a power cell, but not so much that you're destroying your molecules. And so you start to look at some of these things, and you think, well, yeah, this is going to happen anywhere. It's not peculiar to the Earth. So what we're going to start to do is get into this whole question in the next 2 weeks of could life arise elsewhere, taking what you've learned about the evolution of life, the great moments on the Earth, whether it could replay or not, what the extremes are for life, and now let's take that knowledge and go elsewhere. And what I'd like to do is just give a brief mention of this book, Rare Earth. This was written by Peter Ward, a colleague of mine at the University of Washington, and Donald Brownlee. Peter Ward's a paleontologist, Donald Brownlee's an astronomer, and they looked at this very question: how common should life be out in the universe? And their basic conclusion is that unicellular life should be very common, multicellular life, like animals, should be very rare. Now, what do you need to take account of when you start to look for life somewhere else? I've been arguing that you need the organic carbon, you need some time, you need energy, and blah, 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 blah. But they're going to start adding on things. Maybe you need to be a proper distance from a star, because, as we said, we need some kind of solvent, and their assumption is liquid water. You need to be the proper distance from the center of the galaxy. We're actually way out in the edge of the galaxy. Who cares about where you are in the galaxy? Well, it turns out it's important because you're going to get a huge amount of cosmic radiation when you've got every other star going supernova, even if your sun is pretty good. So maybe you don't want to really be in the center of activity. You might need to have a star of a proper mass. Okay? If they're too large, they burn too fast and they have too short a lifetime. If they're too small, maybe it's not enough energy to power things like photosynthesis. Maybe it's too small to hang on to any sort of rocky bodies out there. Oceans, again, we're suggesting that you need to have liquid water. You don't want too much maybe, but because you might have an unstable atmosphere. Maybe you don't need liquid water. Maybe you can deal with another liquid. You might need a constant energy output, because if the sun decides to take a year off, we've got big problems. Once you absolutely freeze over, you may not ever be able to melt that ice again. Similarly, if you end up with a runaway greenhouse like our poor little neighbor Venus did, even if it cools down, you may never get those oceans back. You need some kind of evolution. You need to have life originating and somehow taking off, and you need to avoid disasters. Again, the stuff happens. But it goes more than that. It gets even more subtle in their argument. Maybe you have to have a Jupiter-like planet, and I believe Jeff Marcy mentioned this idea, because when you've got a large guy out there in the neighborhood, he's probably taken a certain number of hits for us from comets and asteroids and so on. And so maybe he's protected us a couple of times from getting hits. So instead of just 2 or 3 really bad hair days in 4.6 billion years, maybe there would have been 100. Maybe there would have been one, fairly recently. Well, not fairly recently, because we would have noticed. but relatively recently. So maybe we need to have a Jupiter out there to sort of clean up the solar system. Maybe we need to have a large nearby moon, and this is something I danced over at the very first lecture. Remember, we talked about what good is the moon. Well, the moon, our moon, is very large compared to the size of the Earth. In fact, it's so large that it helps to stabilize our obliquity, the tilt of the Earth with respect to the orbital plane. And this is what helps to stabilize our climate and stabilize our seasons. So without this, we would have a chaotic obliquity, like Mars does. And so you have these huge swings in temperature changes and so on. I have colleagues who have modeled what would happen if we had an obliquity of 0 versus an obliquity of 90. And what you see is you start to go to these really high obliquities, some intercontinental places like in the middle of the Soviet, Russia, you would end up with temperatures like 40, 50, 100 degrees centigrade in the summer and minus 100 in the winter. Now, obviously, this is not habitable. So the obliquity is really important. On the other hand, 0 would be a whole other set of problems. But what if it was chaotic? So we were swinging back and forth between the two every 10,000 years or so. That's nothing in evolutionary time. Would we be able to have life at all? And even if we had life, how sophisticated would it be? Maybe it would have to go right back into a desiccated state or a heat-resistant spore or underwater very, very quickly, and so it wouldn't be able to evolve with the sort of stability that we need to form something like us. What about plate tectonics? They argue that they're extremely important in recycling greenhouse gases, so you don't have a good atmosphere without it. Now, Mars no longer has plate tectonics. And maybe that's its problem. Maybe you have to, maybe you don't. Now, I'm not saying that you have to buy every one of these arguments. What I'm saying is they make arguments that there are many, many more planetary factors that we may need to take into account besides how far from the sun we are, whether you have advanced life or not. Now, on the other hand, I've argued that multicellularity is fairly trivial. And so I will say that I don't completely buy every one of their arguments, but you might want to read this. It's a very readable book, and I will say on film that I alternated. Most of the time I said, damn, I wish I'd written that. This is really brilliant. And occasionally I looked at it and I said, why on earth did they say that? So anyway, it's a great book. Peter Ward's written a whole bunch of books that are very accessible. But it does start to stretch out this idea in your mind, what does it really take for habitability? So let's sort of tie all this together. I'm arguing that evolution's a tinkerer, and again, we'll put the link to the Francois Jacob article, very readable as well, to get you to think of evolution in those terms, that it's like a tinkerer. So you're dealing with the raw material that you have, but you're constrained by the laws of physics, chemistry, whatever developmental history that organism already has, and the history of that individual organism. But evolution makes its way to localize adaptive peaks. The Drosophila doesn't check every enzyme in its body before mating with another, cute Drosophila. They say there's an attraction between us, and they do, whatever Drosophila do in their little bottles. But if we stand back, can we see certain major adaptive peaks? And I've argued, yes, you can see an adaptive peak going for autotrophy and probably photosynthesis. You can see an adaptive peak for herbivory and then one for carnivory. So how life gets there may be contingent. We wouldn't necessarily have traveled the same path we did. If the dinosaurs hadn't gone extinct, maybe we wouldn't have been here, or maybe we would have been intelligent dinosaurs, and each of these chairs would have a hole in the back so we could stick our tails through, and we'd be off eating little mammals for dinner, whatever. But that there would be these metabolic trends, and these are what I'm talking about, these major adaptive peaks that we could predict would have happened again on the Earth and over and over. If we only replayed the tape to the origin of mammals, it looks like intelligence probably would have arisen. We would have had some that figured out how to eat ants. We would have had some that figured out how to dig underground. Some may well have gone back to the water because it's happened multiple times in multiple lineages. So apparently it is not all that hard to do for a mammal. But like I say, how life gets there may be contingent, but these general selective pressures are going to give us certain patterns. So that's, again, my argument. You're more than welcome to disagree with any parts. And so I'm going to summarize it by this wonderful Gary Larson cartoon. I've resisted showing Gary Larson all semester. I love him. You can see at this dinosaur convention, the picture's pretty bleak, gentlemen. The world's climates are changing, and think of that as the environment. The mammals are taking over, think of that as competition. And we have a brain about the size of a walnut, and that's biology. And so that's why the dinosaurs went extinct. That's where you start to get, things happening.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.